So what we're going to look at is event-driven programming, and basically there are 3-4 types of programming paradigm. What BTEC does is it breaks those up a lot, and it says these are all very different and used in different ways. It's not exactly true. Most programs use a combination of all 3 or 4 types. So your main types that BTEC kind of goes on about is procedural programming, which is where you have a block of code that runs from start to finish and can be called from different parts of the program. Event-driven programming, which is what we're going to look at, which look at programming being triggered by different events. So different things the user does or the system does that generate events cause different bits of the program to run. And finally, there's object-oriented programming, which is kind of looking at programs as a collection of objects with their own data associated. You may or may not do object-oriented next year. If I'm here, you probably won't, because it's very difficult and it's getting a little bit outdated. People are starting to say this isn't how we should be looking at programs. So for the moment, we'll look at event-driven programming. And the first question from that, Christy, is what an event is, right? So events are usually some kind of user interaction. So clicking on a button, typing text in, moving a mouse over a particular object are all events. Yeah, if you think about something like Windows, there's lots of events you can trigger, like right-clicking on the screen does something, left-clicking does something else, etc. Typing does something else. Those all have events and event handlers and event loops associated with them. We'll get onto those in a second. You can have events that are just triggered by the system or by the program itself. So you can have something like a timer, where the timer runs down, and when the timer finishes, a new bit of the program starts. Yeah. You can have things like network traffic hitting the computer, or a print message coming into the computer, trigger events. So something like a paper jam from the printer, that message being sent back up triggers an event that causes a pop-up in Windows to alert you to the fact that the printer's jammed. Make sense? So those are events, and there are a couple of things associated with them. One is an event loop or an event listener, and the other is an event handler. So we'll look at those in more detail. I just want to see what I've got down here. So the objects that events happen to are usually elements in the GUI. Event-driven programming is very focused towards GUIs, and it's why it's now one of the primary methods of programming, because it works so well with things like Windows, OS X, etc. And the expectation of people using computers now is they are going to use some kind of graphical interface, and graphical interfaces generate lots and lots of events. So this is the basic structure of how event-driven programming responds to events. So first we have some user interaction. That could also be a system message or a timer or something else. That's detected by an event loop or an event listener. That's a little bit of code that's just running in the background going, have they left clicked, have they left clicked, have they left clicked, have they left clicked. When that left click occurs, that then sends a message to an event handler. The event handler is the bit of code that does something because of that. So for instance, when I left click on the screen, the event loop detects I've left clicked and sends a message that causes this to appear. Yeah, if I right click, it sends a message, but it gets a different event handler and causes something else to happen. Make sense? So event loops or event listeners are the things waiting to detect the user interaction or the system message. Event handlers are the bit that actually handle running the code itself. And that event handler then runs a subroutine, so runs a section of code. It doesn't run an entire program, it runs one part of that program, which you'll see as we go into doing some event-driven programming on Visual Studio. It does quite clearly break into, this is what happens when this button's pressed. This is what happens when they put some text in. This is what happens when this timer runs out. Okay? So let's see if we've got any more. Oh yeah. So the advantages and disadvantages of event-driven programming. They're extremely flexible, right? So I can left click on the screen, I can right click on the screen, I can type, I can have it respond to different buttons, different shortcuts. Alt F4 will do something, Alt F3 will do something else. So you can build a ton of events into your program in a way that you couldn't do using sort of procedural code and having to go through every single step. It would take way too long. As I said, they're really suitable for GUIs. In fact, a GUI is effectively a large event-driven program. Yeah. They also use procedural and object-oriented code because you can't actually create event-driven programs without using those. But the emphasis is on events and how events interact with the GUI. They're easier to code. If you sat down and sort of thought about, oh, I want to write Windows, yeah, it's an enormous job for one team or one person to go through and write all that code. By breaking it into events, it means you can divide the code up between people really easily. If you're just working on a simple project, you can and something isn't working, you can go and just go, okay, that's the bit of code where that doesn't work, so I can go and fix that. So it's quite a nice approach to programming in that you're only addressing those parts of the code that you're currently working on. You don't have to go back and rewrite everything else to get it to work with it. And ease of development I kind of wrapped in there as well. A graphical IDE, by the way, which is on the lecture slide there, is something like Visual Studio. It's a integrated development environment. Sounds right. It's basically a way of supporting writing programs so you don't have to do it all out of Notepad. It's just about doable for HTML. If you try and write C# out of Notepad, you'll really struggle. Disadvantages can cause quite a lot of slowing down due to the event loops. So if you think all those things that I can do on a Windows screen, something has to be listening to see if I do those the entire time, and that eats up a lot of memory space. It's one of the primary reasons why Windows, for instance, is such a memory hog. The other reason being it's poorly optimized, and it's been going so long that they've got bits of code in there that are just massive and bloaty. The commands themselves can be very complicated to write, especially if you're writing your own event handlers as well. If you're writing your own event loops, which we won't be doing, it gets even more complicated. So the commands themselves can be quite complex in order how you form them, especially when you need to get information about how the event happened. So did the user click the mouse down once? Did they click and hold it? Did they double click it? If you have to program all that in, that's quite tricky. Testing is a pain in the butt, right? Because the program will usually run with bugs, and will run with loads and loads of bugs if you let it. Because it's broken into separate events, unless the event is triggered, you won't get an error message, you won't get the program crashing. Instead, it will just keep running and you won't know it's wrong. With a program that's just running through from top to bottom, if something's wrong, you're guaranteed to find it because the program won't work from the start. Okay? So with event-driven type of programs, you need to go through and check every single event. And while that sounds like a pain in the butt now, by the time you've got dozens of events up, it can be quite hard to work out what every event is, and that's why you get copies of programs that don't work when you do something or crash when you do something, because they've managed to miss that in testing. All right? Anybody totally confused? Any questions? Cool.